Hello, my name is Tom J. McCoy and I'm a director from Arizona. Today I'm doing a tutorial on the best web export settings in Adobe Premiere. So before I start, I just want to say that this tutorial is brought to you by videoblocks.com. All the footage from the beginning of this video is downloaded straight from VideoBlocks. If you go to their website, you can download 4K footage, standard definition, 1080p footage. They have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of files you can choose from, and they have plenty of filters where you can really narrow down your options. If you go to the website, they have a 7-day free trial. I highly recommend checking it out. It's very cool. So I'm just going to dive right into the tutorial. The first thing I always do when I'm going to render for online is I create a master ProRes 422HQ file. My reason for doing that is it's much faster to go from a ProRes to an H.264 rather than compressing straight down from a sequence to an H.264, and it's also going to be a lot higher quality. It's much easier. You don't have to do it, but you're going to save a lot of time, and it's usually a higher quality. So this is a ProRes file. So we are ready to go to an H.264. So I'm just going to go to File, Export, Media, and there is options for QuickTime, H.264, but we're not going to use those because you can't actually render 4K in that option. And we're going to be doing 4K settings and 1080p settings. I will put an annotation on the screen to skip to 1080p, but you might miss some details I'm going to go over as to reasoning for doing certain things that I'm doing. So you can go ahead and skip if you want, but you don't have to. Okay, so I have a template I'm going to go off of. It's not a correct template, it's just one I made. But the first thing I always do is I check to make sure my source matches my output, or my output matches my source, I suppose. So this is actually Ultra HD. It's not completely 4K. 4K is actually 4096 by 2160, but this is basically 4K. It's the 16:9 version of 4K. So that matches. The only thing I see that doesn't match is my frame rate, which is 2997. Normally, for film, I would go down to 2398, but for this tutorial, I'm just going to match the sequence and go to 30. We do want square pixels unless you're doing anamorphic or something like that. It's totally up to you, but for 16:9, the option we're doing, we do want square pixels. TV standard, NTSC, profile should actually be on high. We are going for the highest quality. Level 5.1, that is the highest option. Render at maximum depth, we do want to check that. Basically what that's going to do is it's going to take all your color information and you're going to get the maximum depth possible for those colors. So unless you don't want, the best colors, then you can leave it unchecked, but go ahead and check it if you do want the best colors. That's usually the best option. So alright, bitrate settings is the most important part of compressing for online, especially YouTube, where you want to be able to control your compression as much as possible so that YouTube doesn't mess with it. That's why I don't recommend just uploading a ProRes file straight to online. I always go down to H.264 because I want to control my compression. So YouTube does have compression recommendations for 4K at 30 frames per second, which is what we're using. They recommend 35 to 45 megabits per second. 1080, they have 8 megabits per second. Now you don't have to use those. They're more of a guideline. Do what works for you, but I don't recommend going below these because you will lose quality. You usually want to be as high as possible with your bitrate. So for this tutorial, what I've been doing, and I didn't do this before up until the last video I uploaded because I did a lot of research for this one, but I started using the 45 megabits per second as my target bitrate, which is where Premiere is going to try to stay around. But the maximum bitrate is very important, but some people don't understand exactly what it does. Some people will just keep it at the 45 because they don't want to stray away from that because it's not recommended, I guess. But that's not correct. The maximum bitrate, what that does is if you have a certain area of your film where there's a lot of editing, a lot of effects, or a lot of color information, and Premiere needs more bitrate to get all those details in, it will go higher than the target. So what I usually do is I just double this because it shouldn't have to do more than double for anything like that, especially if you're going online. So the maximum bitrate is the most it will use for a lot of color information, but it will try to stay around 45. That's what these two options are. VBR 2-pass, sorry I didn't go over that at first. 1-pass just means it's going to go over your footage once. 2-pass means it's going to go over it twice. So it's going to be very, very thorough if you go over 2 times. Not to say 1 pass is bad, but 2 pass is better. So the next option we have is Advanced Settings keyframe distance. Basically what that's going to do is it's going to use a frame every 90 frames as a reference. I don't usually do it. You don't have to do it. You can. It's not going to hurt, but I usually turn that off. Now that's all the options for 4K. We do want to use maximum render quality, and that's kind of what we're going for. And use previews. This option, I don't fully understand it, but from what I do understand is it uses rendered files from this preview to render your compressed file. I don't usually turn it on. You can experiment with it if you want, but I've never used it. Use frame blending. You don't have to use this. What this actually does is if I did want to go from 2997 to 24 frames per second, I would be losing 6-7 frames out of that frame rate. So what frame blending will do is it will try to obviously blend frames together to make up for those lost frames. But we're just matching our source, so we don't have to use that. I wouldn't recommend using it if you're matching your source, but if you are going down in frame rate or up or whatever, use frame blending. It's going to help you a lot. But do some tests first. Make sure it works for you. So that's the render settings for 4K. Audio stays the same for both 4K and 1080, so I'll just go over them now. Sample rate we do want at 48,000 hertz. Stereo, I mean most of the time it's pretty self-explanatory. You want the highest quality. Highest bitrate, I've seen people use 192, but my audio buddy uses 320, and since he knows about sound a lot more than I do, I'll just take his word for it and go 320. Precedence bitrate. So all this other stuff, you don't mess with it. It's all just silly stuff. You don't want to add Gaussian blur. So just worry about the video and audio. So now we're going to do 1080, which there isn't much of a difference. The only difference is resolution. So 1080p, 1920 by 1080, and the bit rate is going to change. So we do want VBR 2-pass still, and the recommendation from YouTube or Google is 8 megabits per second for 30 frames per second. So we are going to do 8, and as I said before, I always double for my maximum, so we're going to do 16. And this should give you the best quality possible. It's not always 100% correct, but it's definitely a great guideline. I keep saying I totally apologize. It's just like my thinking word, but that's pretty much it. There isn't much else. This is pretty straightforward. And once you know this kind of formula, it's a lot easier to mess around with, but for the most part, this is going to get you the best quality. And I've done a bunch of testing, and I haven't found much better settings than this. So, I said again, but that's pretty much it. I might do a tutorial on After Effects, but normally what I do with After Effects is I use Adobe Dynamic Link and I put it into Premiere and then render from there, or I go into Adobe Media Encoder, which is something I might do a tutorial on. I always render from Premiere, but from what I understand, Adobe Media Encoder does have more options for rendering, and supposedly it's a little bit better, but I don't use it very often. So that's the best render settings for Adobe Premiere. If you have any questions, go in and comment below. I'll try to get back to them as much as I can. And as I said before, people keep asking for Sony Vegas tutorials. I'm really sorry, but I don't have Sony Vegas anymore. I have a Mac. So I covered a lot of ground in Sony Vegas. It's a pretty basic, straightforward program. And really, once you learn one editing program, you can learn most of them. So you can more than likely direct translate things from my newer tutorials into my older ones. So, sorry. But that's it for me today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Like, comment, subscribe if you want more content. Thank you very much. I will see you next time. Bye.
Wow.